I was halfway through stacking hay bales in my barn when I heard the shrill voice of doom calling my name. Bradley Nichols. You need to come out here right now. I sighed, dusted off my hands, and stepped outside. There she was, Teresa Zimmerman, the self-appointed queen of the HOA, standing at the edge of my driveway with her arms crossed so tightly I thought she might snap in half. She had that smug, self-righteous expression that HOAs breed like mold in damp places. What can I do for you, Teresa? I asked, already knowing this wasn't going to be a friendly chat. She scoffed and gestured toward my barn like it was an eyesore instead of the perfectly maintained structure it was. That monstrosity has to go. It violates HOA aesthetic standards. I blinked. You do realize I'm not part of your HOA, right? Teresa's lips curled upward like she had just caught me in some grand lie. Your property is adjacent to our neighborhood and it affects our home values. We had a meeting and the HOA board has decided that your barn is a violation. I let out a slow breath, forcing myself to stay calm. Teresa, I've owned this land long before your HOA existed. You have no authority over my property. She waved a piece of paper at me. We sent you multiple notices. Since you failed to comply, we will be escalating this matter. I took the paper and skimmed through it. It was a classic HOA intimidation tactic full of legal-sounding nonsense, but ultimately meaningless. You can't fine me, I said, handing it back. And you certainly can't force me to tear down my barn. Teresa's face turned red. We'll see about that, Mr. Nichols. With that, she spun on her heel and marched back toward her pristine, cookie-cutter neighborhood. I shook my head. I had dealt with HOA nonsense before, but this was a whole new level of ridiculous. That night, I did some digging. I pulled up property records, HOA bylaws, and city ordinances. The more I read, the more I realized something interesting. Teresa and her HOA weren't as powerful as they thought. In fact, they were in deep financial trouble. That gave me an idea. If Teresa wanted to play hardball, I'd show her exactly how it was done. I spent the next few nights digging deeper, piecing together every scrap of financial and legal information I could find about Teresa's HOA. It didn't take long to uncover the cracks beneath their carefully polished exterior. The HOA wasn't just in trouble, they were drowning. Years of mismanagement, bloated landscaping contracts, and a failed attempt at installing a luxury clubhouse had left them hemorrhaging money. Their reserve fund was practically empty, and they had been hiking dues just to keep the lights on. Then I found the golden ticket. The HOA had taken out a sizable loan to build that clubhouse, using the neighborhood itself as collateral. If they defaulted, which, judging by their financials, was imminent, the lender could foreclose on HOA-owned assets. I didn't just have leverage. I had a way to take their entire kingdom away from them. By the end of the week, I had arranged a meeting with the bank that held the HOA's debt. I walked in prepared, armed with all the right numbers and a proposal they couldn't refuse. I made an offer to buy out the HOA's delinquent loan at a discount, taking control of their debt and, by extension, their assets. The bank, eager to offload a risky loan that was circling the drain, accepted without hesitation. Just like that, I owned the financial noose around Teresa's neck. The following Saturday, I attended the next HOA board meeting. I wasn't a member, of course, but I didn't need to be. I had the legal paperwork in hand, and I was more than happy to let them know exactly what that meant. The meeting was held in the very clubhouse they had nearly bankrupted themselves to build. Teresa sat at the head of the table, flanked by her usual cronies, middle-aged busybodies who thrived on power trips. Their smug confidence evaporated the moment I walked in. "What are you doing here?" Teresa snapped, her eyes narrowing. I took my time, setting down the thick folder of documents on the table. I wanted to discuss the barn issue. But first, I think we need to talk about something far more pressing. She scoffed, arms crossed. You are not a member of this HOA. You have no authority here. I slid a single sheet of paper toward her. Actually, I do. As of yesterday, I own the HOA's outstanding debt. Which means, legally speaking, I now control the mortgage on this clubhouse and any other HOA-owned assets. The room fell silent. Teresa's face drained of color as she snatched the document and scanned it. Her fingers trembled slightly as she flipped through the other pages, her eyes darting from one line to the next. This has to be a mistake, she said, her voice tight. I leaned back in my chair. No mistake. Your HOA defaulted on its loan months ago. The bank was about to initiate foreclosure. I just saved them the trouble by purchasing the debt myself. Which means I now decide the fate of this clubhouse. One of the board members, an older man with a receding hairline, cleared his throat. You can't just take our clubhouse away. The residents paid for this. I nodded. They did. And Teresa here mismanaged their money so badly that this entire HOA was on the verge of collapse. The only reason the bank didn't seize this property sooner was because they were waiting for the paperwork to go through. Now I own that paperwork. Teresa's jaw clenched. You wouldn't dare. I smiled. Oh, I would. And I will. She shot up from her chair, slamming her hands on the table. This is extortion. No, Teresa, I said calmly. This is business. You tried to bully me into tearing down my barn, claiming it lowered property values. Now I get to decide what actually happens to this neighborhood. The panic in her eyes was unmistakable. She had spent years ruling over this HOA like a tyrant, nickel and diming residents, enforcing arbitrary rules and padding her own pockets with ridiculous fees. And now she was helpless. One of the other board members, a woman who had been quiet until now, spoke up. What? What do you want? I tapped the table. 2 things. First, you're going to officially acknowledge that my property is not, and never has been, under HOA jurisdiction. That means no more letters, no more threats, no more nonsense about my barn. Teresa sat back down, her lips pressed into a thin line. And the second thing? I glanced around the room. I'm demolishing this clubhouse. The collective gasp was almost comical. You can't do that. Teresa shrieked. I shrugged. I absolutely can. And I will. The land it sits on will be repurposed into a public green space. No more clubhouse fees. No more maintenance costs draining the HOA's budget. It's the only way for this HOA to survive without raising dues again. The board members exchanged uneasy glances. They knew I was right. The residents had been grumbling about the constant fee hikes for years. If the clubhouse vanished, so would a massive financial burden. Teresa, however, wasn't ready to surrender. You can't just walk in here and take over everything we built. You mean everything you mismanaged? I shot back. Let's be honest, Teresa. You ran this place into the ground. I'm just cleaning up the mess. She opened her mouth to argue, but nothing came out. She knew she had lost. I stood, gathering my papers. Demolition starts next month. I'll be posting notices soon. In the meantime, I suggest you start preparing for a very different kind of HOA meeting, one where you explain to the residents how you let this happen. With that, I turned and walked out, leaving Teresa and her cronies to stew in the wreckage of their failed little empire. I had come here expecting a fight. Instead, I had taken everything from them without lifting a finger. And my barn? It was staying exactly where it was. The demolition of the clubhouse was scheduled for the following month. But word spread through the neighborhood like wildfire within days. Residents who had been under Teresa's iron grip for years were suddenly realizing that the thing they had been forced to pay for the so-called centerpiece of the HOA was a financial sinkhole that had been dragging them down. While some grumbled about losing the building, most were relieved when they learned that their HOA dues wouldn't be increasing again. A few even stopped by my property to shake my hand, finally voicing frustrations they had bottled up for years. The clubhouse had been Teresa's pet project, something she had used to justify absurd fees while ignoring actual maintenance issues throughout the neighborhood. Now, with her control slipping, people were starting to see the truth. Teresa, however, wasn't going down without a fight. Less than a week before the demolition was set to begin, she stormed onto my property flanked by 2 of her remaining loyalists, a wiry man always seen with a clipboard and a woman who had made a career out of tattling on people for minor infractions. They came armed with a folder full of documents, clearly planning one last desperate attempt to stop me. Teresa's voice was sharp as she announced they were filing an injunction against the demolition. She claimed it was an unauthorized destruction of community assets and that I had no right to alter the neighborhood without the majority's approval. I didn't even bother suppressing a chuckle as I leaned against the fence post. Their paperwork might as well have been blank pages for all the legal weight it carried. I pointed out that they had already defaulted on their loan, and since I had legally acquired the debt, the clubhouse and all associated liabilities were mine to do with as I pleased. I also reminded them that the HOA was never supposed to be in the business of real estate in the first place, something Teresa had conveniently ignored when pushing for the clubhouse's construction. Teresa's face twisted in frustration as she realized I wasn't budging. Her backup team, seeing the futility of the situation, began shifting uncomfortably. The clipboard guy attempted to argue about community heritage. but I cut him off by reminding him that the residents were tired of throwing money into a bottomless pit just to maintain a building that barely anyone used. The woman who had come with them, clearly sensing that Teresa's reign was coming to an end, suddenly softened her stance. She hesitantly asked if there was any way to repurpose the space for something useful instead of demolishing it outright. I nodded, telling her that I had already arranged for the land to be converted into a public green space, something that would actually benefit the entire neighborhood instead of serving as a vanity project for power-hungry board members. Teresa's frustration boiled over, and she stomped her foot like a child throwing a tantrum. She accused me of ruining everything and claimed that the HOA would fight back. I calmly reminded her that she no longer had the authority to make those decisions. She could fight all she wanted, but the financial reality of the situation wasn't changing. The clubhouse was coming down, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. With no other options, Teresa turned on her own allies, snapping at them for not backing her up. The clipboard guy muttered something about needing to reevaluate things, while the other woman quickly excused herself. Teresa was losing control, and she knew it. The demolition day arrived with a crowd of curious onlookers. Some came to mourn the loss of a building they had been forced to pay for, but most came to celebrate the downfall of an HOA that had ruled over them with an iron fist for far too long. As the first wall came crashing down, Teresa stood at a distance, arms crossed tightly, watching her empire crumble. She looked smaller than she ever had before, no longer the intimidating figure who had lorded over her neighbors, but just another person who had pushed too far and lost everything. I didn't need to say anything to her. The wreckage of the clubhouse spoke for itself. By the time the dust settled, the neighborhood had already begun to move on. The HOA, now stripped of its financial burdens and its most toxic influence, was forced to restructure. A new board was elected, one that actually listened to the residents instead of dictating their lives. As for me, I went back to my barn, enjoying the quiet satisfaction of knowing that I had not only protected my property but had also freed an entire community from the grip of a corrupt HOA. Teresa never showed her face again after that. Whether she moved away or simply couldn't handle her loss of power, no one really knew and no one particularly cared. All that mattered was that justice had been served. With the clubhouse reduced to rubble and Teresa effectively exiled from her former kingdom, the neighborhood began to breathe a little easier. Without her constant interference, the newly elected HOA board was eager to steer things in a different direction. They reached out to me, hoping to mend fences after years of Teresa's antagonism. I wasn't interested in joining their HOA. Nothing could make me sign away my property rights to a group that had tried to strong-arm me, but I was open to a conversation. The board invited me to a meeting, not in a sterile conference room, but at one of the local parks where residents had gathered to voice their concerns. This wasn't the same HOA anymore. The new president, a man named Greg Hastings, was a retired engineer who had been one of the loudest voices criticizing the previous administration. He wasted no time getting straight to the point. The neighborhood needed repairs. Years of misallocated funds meant that sidewalks were cracked, streetlights were failing, and the community pool had been closed for months due to neglected maintenance. With the clubhouse gone, they finally had room in the budget to fix things, but they needed a stable plan for moving forward. I listened, arms crossed, as Greg laid out the situation. He wasn't asking for my help directly, but it was clear he wanted me on his side. The residents, many of whom had been wary of me before, were now looking at me differently. I wasn't just the outsider with the barn anymore. I was the man who had exposed Teresa's corruption and freed them from years of mismanagement. A woman in her 50s, who introduced herself as Linda, hesitated before speaking up. She admitted she had once supported Teresa, believing her strict rules kept the neighborhood in order. But after seeing how much money had been wasted, she realized they had all been manipulated. Greg took a deep breath. He wanted to know if I had any suggestions. I wasn't about to take on their problems personally, but I did have an idea. I pointed out that their biggest issue wasn't just the lack of funds, it was the lack of trust. Residents had spent years being forced into compliance with arbitrary rules, and now they were being asked to rally behind a group that had failed them before. It wasn't enough to fix sidewalks and pools. They needed to rebuild their relationship with the community. Greg nodded, exchanging a glance with his fellow board members. He knew I was right. I suggested they hold an open forum, not just for complaints but for brainstorming. Let the residents be part of the decision-making process. Make them feel like they had a say in where their money was going. Linda perked up at the idea, mentioning that most people had avoided HOA meetings before because they were just lectures from Teresa and her cronies. If they could make them feel like discussions instead, maybe more people would get involved. Greg grinned, already thinking through the logistics. I made it clear that I wasn't going to be their savior. I had no interest in running their HOA for them. But if they genuinely wanted to make things better, I'd be willing to offer advice now and then. They took it seriously. Within a week, flyers were distributed throughout the neighborhood inviting residents to an open discussion. No fines, no threats, just a chance for people to voice their concerns and offer ideas for moving forward. On the day of the event, I watched from a distance as people arrived. There were more attendees than I expected: families with kids, older couples, even young professionals who had previously stayed out of HOA affairs. The meeting started with Greg acknowledging the past mistakes of the HOA. He didn't sugarcoat it. He laid out exactly how much money had been wasted, how negligent decisions had led to their current situation, and why things needed to change. Then, for the first time in years, the residents actually got to speak. A father of two brought up the issue of broken sidewalks near the school bus stop, pointing out how dangerous they had become. A retired veteran talked about how the HOA had ignored security concerns, prioritizing aesthetic fines over actual safety. A young couple new to the neighborhood asked why there hadn't been any community events in years when their fees were supposedly meant to support them. The board listened. They took notes. They asked follow-up questions instead of brushing concerns aside. By the end of the night, people were cautiously optimistic. It wasn't an overnight fix, but it was a start. As I turned to leave, Greg caught up to me. He thanked me not just for what I had done to expose Teresa, but for pushing them to take a different approach. I shrugged. I hadn't done it for them, I just didn't like being told what to do on my own property. But if my actions had helped them break free from the worst of their HOA nightmare, then maybe it wasn't such a bad thing after all. Linda waved goodbye as I walked back to my land, the barn standing tall in the moonlight. The HOA had tried to control me. They had tried to force me to comply. And in the end, all they had done was destroy themselves. With the clubhouse gone and the new HOA board attempting to rebuild trust, life on my property settled back into its usual rhythm. The barn stood as it always had, untouched and exactly where it belonged. The neighborhood, once ruled by Teresa's oppressive grip, was finally beginning to feel like a place where people could actually live without fear of arbitrary fines and power plays. But Teresa wasn't done causing trouble. She had disappeared for a while, likely licking her wounds after her humiliating downfall. Most assumed she had moved away, but I knew better. People like her didn't just fade into the background. They waited, watching for a moment to strike back. That moment came a few weeks later when I noticed a sleek black sedan idling near the entrance of my driveway. The engine purred softly, but the real giveaway was the flash of a phone camera through the tinted glass. Someone was taking pictures of my property. I had a pretty good idea who was behind it. I walked straight toward the car, and as soon as my boots crunched on the gravel, the sedan peeled away. A glimpse at the license plate confirmed my suspicion. It was registered to a property still owned by Teresa. She wasn't leaving. She was scheming. The next morning, I got a surprise visit. 2 city code enforcement officers stood at my gate, holding clipboards and looking far too serious for an early Tuesday morning. One of them, a man with graying hair and tired eyes, introduced himself and got straight to the point. They had received an anonymous complaint about my barn. Apparently, it was a safety hazard and an unregistered commercial structure. I didn't even try to hide my exasperation. Teresa was trying to play a new angle, this time using city bureaucracy to do her dirty work. I invited the officers onto my property and let them inspect the barn. They walked through, checking everything: foundation, wiring, structural integrity. I knew they wouldn't find anything wrong because I had built it to code years ago. After an hour of poking around, the older officer sighed and shook his head. Nothing was out of compliance. But then his younger partner hesitated. He pulled out another document, flipping through it before looking up at me. There was a new zoning proposal being pushed by a concerned local resident that would reclassify properties like mine as part of the HOA's jurisdiction. If passed, it would give the HOA influence over adjacent lands including mine. I let out a slow breath. Teresa wasn't just trying to bury me in complaints. She was attempting to change the rules entirely. I thanked the officers and sent them on their way. They had been just as annoyed about the baseless complaint as I was. But the zoning attempt? That was something I couldn't ignore. That night, I drove down to the county office to get my hands on the proposal. It was exactly what I suspected. Teresa had filed a petition to have my land reclassified, arguing that it was detrimental to the aesthetic and financial health of the community. The kicker? She had managed to get enough signatures from her old HOA loyalists to push it into formal review. If it wasn't challenged, it could actually go through. I wasn't about to let that happen. The zoning board meeting was scheduled for the following week, and I made sure I was there, front and center. The room was filled with a mix of HOA members, city officials, and a few curious residents who had caught wind of the proposal. Teresa sat near the front, dressed in her usual polished yet overly stiff attire, looking far too pleased with herself. When the board chair called for public comments, Teresa stood first. She spoke with the same authoritative arrogance she had always wielded, painting my barn as an unregulated structure that was bringing down property values. She played the victim well, claiming that the HOA had tried to work peacefully with me but had been met with hostility. Then she turned to the zoning board, arguing that the neighborhood had a right to control the land surrounding it to protect its character. When she finished, she sat down with a satisfied expression, as if she had already won. I stood, taking my time as I stepped to the podium. First, I laid out the facts. My barn was fully permitted, up to code, and had existed long before the HOA was even formed. It was private property, and the HOA had absolutely no legal claim over it. Then I pulled out the financial records I had gathered from my previous dealings with the HOA. I reminded the zoning board that this was the same organization that had mismanaged funds so severely that it had been on the verge of collapse. I didn't just stop there. I presented a petition of my own, one signed by residents who were tired of Teresa's antics. Many of them had no idea she was still pulling strings behind the scenes, and once they found out, they were more than happy to sign against her proposal. I ended with a simple statement. This isn't about community welfare. This is about one person's vendetta. And I think the people in this room deserve to know that. The room buzzed with murmurs as the board deliberated. It didn't take long for them to reach a decision. The zoning proposal was denied. Teresa's face twisted with barely contained rage as the ruling was finalized. She had thrown everything she had left at me, and once again she had lost. As I walked past her, she muttered something under her breath. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Her power was officially gone. A few days later, the black sedan disappeared for good. A for sale sign appeared in Teresa's yard, and within a month she was gone. No one missed her. With her gone, the HOA finally had the chance to rebuild properly. They stuck to their promise of transparency, using the freed-up funds to repair neglected infrastructure and actually listen to the residents. As for me, I got back to my usual life, tending to my land, working in my barn, and enjoying the peace that Teresa had once tried so hard to take from me. But every now and then when I saw the remnants of the demolished clubhouse, I would remember just how close she had come to getting away with it all. And how satisfying it was to watch her entire empire crumble beneath her. With Teresa gone and the HOA under new leadership, I expected things to settle down for good. My barn remained untouched, the neighborhood was finally free of her nonsense, and life had returned to the way it was before she had tried to sink her claws into my land. But there was still one last piece of business left unfinished. The demolition of the clubhouse had been a turning point for the neighborhood, but it had also left behind a large, empty lot where the oversized monument to HOA arrogance had once stood. The new board had initially planned to turn it into a public green space, but with the HOA's financial recovery still in progress, nothing had been done with it yet. One afternoon, Greg Hastings, the new HOA president, stopped by my property. Unlike Teresa, he didn't show up with threats or fake legal documents. He leaned against the fence, arms crossed, looking more like a man trying to solve a puzzle than one trying to enforce control. He admitted that while the HOA was in much better shape than before, there was still lingering resentment among some residents. The scars of Teresa's dictatorship hadn't fully healed, and while many people were relieved she was gone, others felt directionless without someone barking orders at them. I listened, watching the way he carefully chose his words, clearly trying to gauge how much he could say without making it seem like he was asking me for help. He wasn't a man who wanted to owe favors, but he also wasn't proud enough to ignore the fact that I had been the one to expose the HOA's corruption in the first place. Eventually, he got to the point. They needed a way to reestablish trust. Something tangible that people could see as proof that the HOA was truly working for them now, not against them. I asked him what he had in mind. He hesitated before suggesting that maybe the empty lot could be used for something more than just a park. Something that actually benefited the people who had been forced to fund Teresa's nonsense for years. I could see where he was going with it, and I had to admit it wasn't a bad idea. The lot was big enough for a proper community space, something that could be used for weekend farmers markets, outdoor movie nights, and even small town events. More importantly, it would be something the residents actually wanted, not something that had been shoved down their throats by an overbearing HOA board. Greg admitted that the HOA didn't have the funds to build anything extravagant, but if they could get enough local businesses and residents involved, they might be able to turn it into something worthwhile. I leaned on the fence, thinking it over. The truth was, I had no real reason to get involved. My land wasn't part of their HOA, and I had already won the fight against Teresa. But as much as I enjoyed rubbing my victory in her face, I wasn't the type to let a good opportunity go to waste. If I helped, it wouldn't be for the HOA. It would be for the people who had been forced to live under Teresa's rule, the ones who had been fined for parking their cars the wrong way or having the wrong kind of mailbox. I finally told Greg that I'd think about it, but if I was going to be involved, it had to be done on my terms. No bureaucratic nonsense, no HOA interference, just a community-led project that actually gave people something useful. He agreed. Over the next few weeks, word spread through the neighborhood. People who had never attended HOA meetings before suddenly became interested in what was happening with the lot. Some offered to help with construction, others had ideas for how the space could be used. A few local businesses even stepped up to donate materials. As the project took shape, something unexpected happened. The resentment that had been simmering under the surface of the neighborhood began to fade. Without Teresa's constant meddling, people started talking to each other again, working together instead of against one another. The HOA, once a symbol of control and frustration, was now actually listening to the people it was supposed to serve. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt like a real community again. By the time the space was completed, it was unrecognizable from the empty lot it had once been. A large, open pavilion stood in the center, surrounded by picnic tables and garden beds planted by volunteers. A small stage had been built for events, and a section of the lot had even been repurposed as a playground for the local kids. On the day of the grand opening, people gathered in a way they never had before. There were no complaints, no fines, no HOA board members glaring down at them from a raised podium. Just neighbors coming together to celebrate something built by and for them. I stood off to the side, watching as families set up blankets on the grass. Kids ran around without a care, and older residents sat on the benches, talking like old friends. Greg walked up next to me, hands in his pockets, a small smile tugging at his lips. He didn't say much, just a quiet acknowledgement that this never would have happened if Teresa had still been in charge. I nodded. She had tried to control everything, to bend the neighborhood to her will. But in the end, all she had done was unite people against her. And now she was nothing more than a bad memory. As the sun set over the newly built space, I turned and walked back to my land, satisfied that the fight was finally truly over. The HOA had been broken, rebuilt, and reformed. And my barn? It was right where it had always been.